You've seen her face 1,000 times. That woman in the blue work shirt and red polka dot bandana, flexing her bicep under the bold yellow words, "We can do it," she's everywhere on coffee mugs, t-shirts, inspirational posters in classrooms and offices across America. She's become the universal symbol of female empowerment, the face we all think of when we imagine American women during World War II. Her name? Rosie the Riveter. But here's the thing that's going to blow your mind. Almost everything you think you know about that iconic image is wrong. And the real story of American women in World War II? It's so much more incredible, so much more complex, and so much more important than that simplified poster could ever capture. Let's start with the poster itself. That famous "We Can Do It" image wasn't created by Norman Rockwell, like many people assume. It was designed by a guy named J. Howard Miller in 1942 for the Westinghouse Electric Corporation. And get this, it was never intended to recruit women into the workforce at all. It was an internal motivational poster displayed only at Westinghouse facilities for about 2 weeks in February 1943, meant to boost morale among women who were already working there. Most Americans never even saw it during the war. The image that actually became famous during the war was Norman Rockwell's completely different depiction of Rosie, a much grittier, muscular woman with a rivet gun on her lap and her foot crushing a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. That version appeared on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post in May 1943 and reached millions of readers. Rockwell's Rosie was tough, powerful, and unapologetically masculine in her strength. She looked like someone who could actually build a bomber. So how did Miller's poster become the face of Rosie? It was rediscovered in the early 1980s during the second wave feminist movement. Activists searching for historical symbols of female strength stumbled upon it in the National Archives, and it exploded into popular culture. By the 1990s, it had completely eclipsed Rockwell's version in the public imagination. The Smithsonian Magazine put it on their cover in 1994, and it became one of the 10 most requested images at the National Archives and Records Administration. But the confusion doesn't stop there. For decades, a woman named Geraldine Hoff Doyle claimed she was the model for the poster. She'd seen a wartime photograph of a woman working at a lathe and assumed it was her from her brief time working in a factory in 1942. When she later saw the "We Can Do It" poster, she put 2 and 2 together and figured she must be the famous Rosie. Organizations honored her. She gave interviews. The story spread everywhere. Except it was all mistaken identity. In 2015, a professor named James Kimball tracked down the original photograph and discovered the woman, and it wasn't Geraldine Doyle at all. It was a 20-year-old named Naomi Parker, photographed at Naval Air Station Alameda in California in March 1942, when Doyle was still in high school in Michigan. Parker and her sister had known about the mistaken identity for 5 years before Kimball found them, but nobody had listened when they tried to correct the record. Naomi Parker Fraley finally got recognition as the woman in the photograph before she died in January 2018 at age 96. And even that photograph probably didn't inspire Miller's poster. Westinghouse historians say Miller typically worked from live models, not photographs. The whole thing is layers upon layers of misconceptions, built up over decades into a neat, simple story that's easier to remember than the messy truth. This is the perfect metaphor for how we remember American women in World War II. We've taken an incredibly complex, diverse, revolutionary moment in history and reduced it to a single image and a catchy slogan. We think we know the story. Women went to work in factories while men fought overseas, then went back home when the boys came back. Simple, patriotic, inspiring. But the real story? It involves over 19 million women in the workforce by 1945. It includes 350,000 women who served in military uniform, officially, for the first time in American history. It features over 10,000 women who broke enemy codes and shortened the war by years. It encompasses women who flew every type of military aircraft, including bombers and fighters, ferrying them across the country and testing them after repairs. It includes African American women who faced down both racism and sexism to claim their place in the war effort. It involves women who worked 80-hour weeks in shipyards and aircraft factories, then came home to take care of children and households without modern appliances or conveniences. The real story is about a social revolution that changed America forever, that cracked open doors that would never fully close again, that laid the groundwork for the women's rights movement and every advancement in gender equality that followed. So forget that poster for a moment. Forget Rosie the Riveter as you know her, because we're about to dive into the real history of American women in World War II, and I promise you, it's nothing like what you've been told. Let's talk numbers, because the scale of what happened between 1941 and 1945 is almost impossible to comprehend from our modern perspective. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, about 12 million women were in the paid workforce. That sounds like a lot until you realize it represented only about 25% of all adult women. The cultural expectation was clear: women, especially married women, belonged at home. In fact, many employers had explicit policies against hiring married women, and some states even had laws restricting their employment. By the time victory was declared in August 1945, that number had surged to over 19 million women in the workforce, an increase of more than 7 million in less than 4 years. Nearly 1 in 3 adult women was now working outside the home. But here's what makes that statistic even more remarkable. The percentage of married women working doubled during the war, from 15% to 30%. The demographic that had been most excluded from paid work was now flooding into it. And we're not talking about women filling traditional female jobs. Yes, some worked as nurses, secretaries, and teachers. But over 6 million women went into war industries, jobs that had been exclusively male territory just months before. 475,000 women worked in aircraft factories alone, building the B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators that would carry the war to Germany, assembling the P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts that would rule the skies over Europe. Women made up 65% of the workforce in the aviation industry by 1943. In shipyards across the country, women welded, riveted, and assembled the Liberty ships that kept supply lines open across the Atlantic and Pacific. They manufactured ammunition, assembled tanks, wired electrical systems, and operated massive industrial machinery. They worked with toxic chemicals and heavy machinery in conditions that would make modern OSHA inspectors lose their minds. But the numbers that really tell the story are these. American industry produced nearly 300,000 aircraft during World War II, over 86,000 tanks, nearly 650,000 jeeps, over 800 warships, and more than 5,000 cargo ships. Millions upon millions of tons of ammunition, weapons, vehicles, and equipment. And women didn't just help build all of that. They were absolutely essential to making it happen. Without women in the workforce, American war production would have collapsed. There simply weren't enough men available to fill all those factory jobs and fight the war at the same time. The 16 million American men who served in uniform had to come from somewhere, and women filled the gap they left behind, and then some. But even those staggering numbers don't capture the full picture, because we haven't even talked about the 350,000 women who served in military uniform. The Women's Army Corps. The WAC recruited over 150,000 women during the war. The Navy's waves, women accepted for volunteer emergency service, brought in another 86,000. The Coast Guard SPARS enlisted about 13,000 women. The Marine Corps Women's Reserve added another 23,000. The Army and Navy Nurse Corps together had over 74,000 women serving in combat zones from North Africa to the Philippines. Then there were the 1,100 women Air Force service pilots, the WASPs, who flew over 60 million miles ferrying aircraft, towing targets for anti-aircraft practice and testing repaired planes. 38 of them died in service to their country. And we're still not done, because over 10,000 women worked as cryptanalysts and code breakers, the so-called code girls, who cracked Japanese and German codes and gave Allied commanders the intelligence they needed to win crucial battles. Most of them worked in total secrecy and remained silent about their contributions for decades after the war. Add it all up, and you're looking at something like 20 million American women who directly contributed to the war effort in ways that shattered every previous assumption about what women could or should do. 20 million women who said yes when their country called, even when that country had spent generations telling them their place was in the home and nowhere else. But numbers only tell you so much. To understand what these numbers really meant, let's meet one woman who lived this transformation. To really see what it was actually like to be a woman in 1942 who suddenly found herself wielding a welding torch or putting on a military uniform. To understand the resistance they faced, the obstacles they overcame, and the legacy they left behind. Because that's where the real story is. Not in the statistics, as impressive as they are, but in the lived experiences of millions of individual women who fundamentally changed America. Sybil Lewis. In 1941, she was a Black woman living in Oklahoma, working as a domestic servant, one of the few jobs available to African American women at the time. She made about $3.50 per week, which barely covered her basic needs. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and suddenly defense plants were hiring. By 1942, Sybil found herself at Lockheed Aircraft in California, working as a riveter on P-38 Lightning fighters. Her pay? $48 per week, more money than she'd ever imagined making. But getting that job wasn't automatic. When Sybil first applied, Lockheed turned her away. They weren't hiring Black women. It wasn't until the white labor pool was nearly exhausted in late 1942 that companies like Lockheed finally, reluctantly, started hiring African American women. And even then, Sybil and women like her faced segregated facilities, were assigned to the worst shifts, and were often given the most dangerous or dirtiest jobs in the plant. Sybil's story captures two crucial truths about women's work in World War II. First, it represented an economic revolution, especially for women who had been locked out of decent-paying jobs their entire lives. Second, that revolution came with massive asterisks attached. Race, class, and gender all determined what opportunities were available and under what conditions. For white middle-class women, the transformation was different, but equally dramatic. Take in Howell, who had never worked outside her home before December 1941. She'd spent her 20s getting married, having children, and managing her household, exactly what society expected of her. But when her husband enlisted in early 1942 and suddenly found herself needing to support two young children on an Army private salary, which was basically impossible. And did something that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. She answered one of those women wanted for war work advertisements and applied for a job at a shipyard. She'd never operated machinery more complex than a sewing machine. She'd never worked with metal or power tools. She'd certainly never done heavy industrial labor. The training program lasted 2 weeks. 2 weeks to learn welding, riveting, blueprint reading, and safety procedures. 2 weeks to transform from housewife to shipyard worker. It sounds impossible, and in some ways it was. The first few weeks on the job were brutal. Anne's hands blistered, her back ached, and she went home every night exhausted in ways she'd never experienced. But she stuck with it, and within 3 months, she was welding hull plates on Liberty ships, doing work that supervisors admitted was as good as or better than many of the male welders. That 2-week training program wasn't unique to Anne's shipyard. It was standard across most war industries. The government and private industry created massive crash training programs to turn women with no industrial experience into skilled workers practically overnight. They produced training films showing women how to operate lathes, drill presses, and milling machines. They published instructional booklets with titles like "You're Going to Employ Women" that taught male supervisors how to work with female employees. The skepticism those supervisors felt was palpable in those publications. The booklets spent pages reassuring male managers that yes, women really could do this work. They emphasized that women's natural abilities, attention to detail, manual dexterity, patience, actually made them ideal for certain precision work. They stressed that women wouldn't disrupt the workplace if they were managed properly. The subtext was clear. We know you don't think women can do this, but we need them, so you're going to have to get over it. And get over it they did, because women proved themselves on the factory floor every single day. At Boeing's Seattle plant, women went from 0% of the workforce in 1941 to 47% by 1944. At Ford's massive Willow Run plant, which turned out to be 24 Liberator bombers, women made up more than 40% of workers by war's end. These weren't token hires or women doing light work. They were running press brakes, operating overhead cranes, riveting wing sections, and welding fuselages. The work was dangerous in ways that are hard to imagine today. Women worked with caustic chemicals that burned their skin. They climbed inside cramped aircraft fuselages to install rivets, sometimes in scorching heat or freezing cold. They operated heavy machinery that could crush a hand or arm in seconds if you made a mistake. Industrial accidents were common. Women lost fingers, suffered burns, were struck by falling objects, or were injured by machinery. And they did all of this while wearing clothing that was designed for men. Factories didn't have uniforms that fit women's bodies properly. Women wore oversized coveralls cinched tight with belts, boots that were too big, and safety equipment that didn't fit right. Long hair, which most women had at the time, was a serious safety hazard around machinery, which is why so many women adopted the practical solution of wearing bandanas or headscarves to keep hair contained. That's where the iconic image of Rosie with her polka dot bandana actually came from. It was a practical safety measure, not a fashion statement. But beyond the physical challenges, there was a psychological transformation happening. Women who had spent their entire lives being told they were fragile, that they needed male protection, that they couldn't handle rough work or make important decisions, were suddenly doing exactly those things. They were making more money than many of them had ever seen. They were supporting their families. They were contributing to the war effort in tangible, visible ways. Josephine von Miklos, who worked at a Douglas aircraft plant in Long Beach, California, later recalled, "We felt like we were doing something important. We were building planes that were going to help win the war. That meant something. It gave you pride in yourself and in your work." That sense of purpose, of contributing to something bigger than yourself, shows up again and again in oral histories and memoirs from women who worked in war industries. But let's be clear, this wasn't some feminist awakening for most women at the time. The vast majority didn't go to work in war industries because they wanted careers or were seeking independence from traditional gender roles. They went to work because their country needed them, because their families needed the money, because it was the patriotic thing to do. The government's propaganda machine framed war work as women's duty, their way of contributing to victory, their chance to support the men fighting overseas. The messaging was careful to reassure everyone, especially men, that this was temporary. When the war was over, women would happily return to their proper place in the home. The jobs were just being kept warm until the men came back. Nobody was trying to fundamentally change society. This was a wartime emergency measure, nothing more. That messaging was a lie, or at least a half-truth, and everyone would figure that out soon enough. Because once women had tasted economic independence, once they'd proven to themselves and everyone else that they could do men's work, once they'd experienced the satisfaction of a paycheck with their name on it, well, some of them weren't going to be so eager to go back to the kitchen. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In 1942 and 43, as millions of women poured into war factories, most of them probably believed what they were told. This was temporary. This was patriotic. This was necessary for victory. They weren't thinking about long-term social change. They were thinking about getting through the day, learning their jobs, making their quotas, and getting home to take care of their families. Because here's something those propaganda posters never showed: most of these women were doing double duty. They'd work an 8 or 10-hour shift at the factory, then come home to a second shift of cooking, cleaning, childcare, and household management. There were no dishwashers, no washing machines, no microwaves, no convenience foods. Everything had to be done by hand, and rationing made it all harder. And the women were expected to do it all without complaint, because complaining would be unpatriotic. We'll dig deeper into that double burden later. But for now, just sit with this image: millions of American women, transformed practically overnight from housewives and domestic servants into the industrial workforce that built the arsenal of democracy. It was an unprecedented social experiment, and nobody was quite sure how it would turn out. Here's something that shocked supervisors and managers across American industry during World War II. Women weren't just adequate replacements for male workers. In many cases, they were better. The stereotype going into the war was clear. Women were physically weaker than men. They were more emotional and less rational. They lacked mechanical aptitude. They couldn't handle stress or make quick decisions. Every assumption embedded in American culture suggested that women doing industrial work would be less productive, less efficient, and less capable than men. The data told a completely different story. At Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, one of the largest shipbuilding operations in the country, managers kept careful productivity records comparing male and female workers. What they found was startling. Women riveters working on ship hulls averaged about 1,000 holes per day. Men doing the same work averaged 650. Women weren't just keeping pace. They were nearly 50% more productive. At various aircraft plants, managers reported similar results. Women doing precision assembly work, installing electrical systems, assembling instrument panels, working with small parts and intricate connections, consistently matched or exceeded the output of male workers. On tasks requiring fine motor control and attention to detail, women often outperformed men significantly. Now, part of this wasn't about inherent gender differences. It was about motivation and context. Many of the male workers who'd been in these jobs before the war had been doing them for years. The work was routine, sometimes boring. Pay was okay, but not great. It was just a job. But for the women who flooded into war industries, this was new, exciting, important. They knew their work was directly contributing to the war effort. They felt like they were part of something bigger. That sense of purpose translated into higher productivity. There were also practical factors at play. Many industrial jobs didn't actually require physical strength as much as they required precision, patience, and attention to detail. Riveting, for example, isn't about muscling rivets into place. It's about positioning them correctly and using pneumatic tools properly. Women who'd spent years doing intricate needlework or detailed cooking had developed excellent fine motor skills that translated directly to assembly line work. But we can't ignore the elephant in the room. Women were paid less than men for doing the exact same work, and they knew it. So why would they be more productive? Part of it was that they felt they had to prove themselves constantly. They were under scrutiny in ways male workers never were. Every mistake a woman made on the job reflected not just on her but on all women. The pressure to perform perfectly was enormous. Inez Sauer, who worked at Boeing during the war, later recalled, "We knew people were watching us, waiting for us to screw up so they could say, 'See, women can't do this work.' So we made damn sure we didn't screw up. We double-checked everything. We took pride in our work because we had to." That combination of pride, pressure, and purpose created workers who were meticulous and highly productive. The absenteeism data is particularly fascinating. Pre-war conventional wisdom held that women workers would be unreliable, they'd call in sick more often, they'd miss work because of female problems, they'd be distracted by family concerns. In reality, women's absenteeism rates were about the same as men's, and in some factories, they were lower. When women did have higher absenteeism, it was almost always because they were carrying the double burden of factory work and full household responsibility, which we'll explore in depth later. But there's another productivity factor that's often overlooked. Women brought different perspectives and problem-solving approaches to industrial work, and sometimes that led to innovations and improvements. At some factories, women workers suggested modifications to assembly processes or tool designs that made work faster or safer. They weren't hidebound by, "We've always done it this way," thinking because they were new to the work. They could see inefficiencies that male workers had stopped noticing years ago. Of course, not all supervisors and managers were willing to admit any of this. There was significant resistance to acknowledging that women workers were performing well. Some managers attributed women's productivity to natural feminine traits like patience and nimble fingers, reinforcing stereotypes rather than recognizing women's actual capabilities. Others simply refused to promote women or give them more responsible positions, no matter how well they performed. The pay gap was the clearest evidence of this discrimination. Despite the government's stated policy that women doing men's work should receive equal pay, in practice, this almost never happened. Factories got around equal pay requirements in creative ways. They'd reclassify jobs when women took them over, giving them new titles that just happened to pay less. They'd claim the work required less physical strength when women did it, so it deserved lower pay. They'd promote men faster, so even if starting pay was equal, men quickly moved into higher-paid positions. On average, women in war industries earned about 60% of what men earned for comparable work. Some women challenged this. The United Electrical Workers Union, which represented workers in many electrical equipment and aircraft plants, fought for equal pay for its female members. In some cases, they won significant victories, forcing employers to narrow or eliminate the gender pay gap. But these were exceptions. Most women had no practical recourse if they were paid less than male coworkers doing identical work. Here's what makes the productivity story even more remarkable. Women achieved these results despite working in hostile environments. Sexual harassment was rampant and completely normalized. Male workers and supervisors made crude comments, touched women without permission, and created uncomfortable situations constantly. Women who complained were often told they were being oversensitive or couldn't take a joke. Some were fired for complaining. So most women just endured it and focused on doing their jobs. Physical facilities weren't designed for women either. Factories built for all-male workforces didn't have adequate bathrooms for women. Some had no changing facilities. Safety equipment, as mentioned earlier, didn't fit properly. Workstations were designed for average male height and reach, making them awkward for many women to use. Despite all these obstacles, productivity remained high. Then there was the social hostility many women faced. Not everyone thought women should be doing this work. Some people saw women in factories as unwomanly, as abandoning their proper roles. Women in war industries sometimes faced criticism and social ostracism in their communities. They were accused of neglecting their children or trying to steal men's jobs. The propaganda celebrating Rosie the Riveter coexisted with significant social disapproval of actual women doing industrial work. African American women faced all of these obstacles plus racial discrimination. They were the last hired and first fired. They got the worst jobs in the plant, often the hottest, dirtiest, most dangerous positions. They faced discrimination from white female coworkers as well as from men. Facilities were segregated. When black women used white restrooms, it sometimes triggered hate strikes where white workers walked off the job. Yet black women's productivity remained high, driven by the knowledge that they were not only proving what women could do, but also what black people could do. By 1944, the productivity of American war industries was the highest in the world. The United States was outreducing Germany, Japan, and Italy combined by enormous margins. Women were a crucial part of that industrial might. They'd proven beyond any reasonable doubt that they could do industrial work as well as or better than men. But here's the dark irony: all that evidence, all that productivity, all those contributions weren't enough to change most minds about women's proper place in society. When the war ended, as we'll see later, millions of these women were pushed out of their jobs to make way for returning veterans. The productivity data was forgotten. The contributions were minimized. And America convinced itself that women had only ever been temporary workers, filling in until the men came home. That betrayal was coming, but in 1943 and 44, as production hit its peak, women on factory floors across America were too busy building bombers and welding ships to worry much about what would happen after victory. They were, quite literally, building the tools that would win the war. And while millions worked in factories, thousands of other women were taking to the skies in roles even more unexpected and even more dangerous. Imagine this scene. It's 1943, and you're standing on a dusty airfield in Sweetwater, Texas, in the middle of absolutely nowhere. The temperature is pushing 100 degrees. And watching you are dozens of male Army Air Forces officers, arms crossed, deeply skeptical expressions on their faces. You're about to take a 25-ton military aircraft, a plane specifically designed to tow targets for anti-aircraft gunnery practice, and fly it solo for the first time. Oh, and you're a 22-year-old woman who, until a few months ago, had never flown anything heavier than a small private plane. This was the reality for the Women Air Force Service pilots, the WASPs, and it was one of the most radical experiments of World War II. Because unlike women working in factories, which could at least be framed as an extension of women's domestic roles, there was absolutely no cultural framework for women flying military aircraft. This was territory so far outside traditional gender roles that many people insisted it was impossible. Not inadvisable, not inappropriate, literally impossible. Women, they insisted, simply could not handle the physical and mental demands of piloting military aircraft. Two women proved them spectacularly wrong: Jacqueline Cochran and Nancy Harkness Love. Jacqueline Cochran was already one of the most accomplished pilots in America before the war. She'd set speed records, won air races, and earned recognition as one of the best aviators in the country, male or female. When war broke out, she immediately saw an opportunity. The Army Air Forces needed pilots desperately. Training a pilot took months and cost a fortune. Meanwhile, there were hundreds of experienced female pilots in America who already knew how to fly. Why not use them to ferry aircraft, tow targets, test planes after repairs, all the jobs that didn't involve combat, but freed up male pilots for combat duty? Nancy Harkness Love had the same idea. She proposed creating a women's ferrying squadron within the Air Transport Command. Love was married to a high-ranking air transport officer, which gave her access to decision-makers. She pushed her proposal hard, and in September 1942, the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, WWII, was born. The program recruited female pilots who already had extensive flight experience and put them to work ferrying aircraft from factories to military bases. Meanwhile, Cochrane was working on something more ambitious. She wanted to create a program to train women from scratch to become military pilots. Not just use women who already knew how to fly, but actively recruit and train new female pilots specifically for military aviation. The result was the Women's Flying Training Detachment, which merged with Love's WFES in August 1943 to become the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASPs. The training program was based at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, chosen specifically because it was remote and could accommodate the secrecy and experimentation the program required. The Army Air Forces didn't want media attention or public scrutiny while they figured out whether this wild idea could actually work. The training itself was brutal, identical to the program male Army pilots went through, with absolutely no accommodations made for the fact that the trainees were women. 27 weeks of ground school, primary flight training, basic flight training, and advanced flight training. The women learned aerodynamics, navigation, meteorology, aircraft engines, and military regulations. They flew in every kind of weather condition. They practiced emergency procedures, instrument flying, night flying, and formation flying. The physical demands were immense. Flying in 1940s military aircraft wasn't like flying a modern plane. There were no power assists, no computerized systems. Everything was mechanical. To bank a heavy bomber required serious upper body strength. You were manhandling a control yoke that didn't want to move. Landing required strength, coordination, and split-second timing. One mistake could mean a crashed aircraft and a dead pilot. The washout rate was about 30%, comparable to the male program. Women failed for the same reasons men did. Some couldn't handle the physical demands. Some froze up during emergencies. Some couldn't master instrument flying or formation flying. Some simply decided military aviation wasn't for them. The instructors didn't go easy on female trainees. The standards were the standards, and if you couldn't meet them, you were gone. The women who made it through emerged as highly skilled, confident military pilots. They'd flown everything from small trainers to heavy twin-engine aircraft. They could navigate cross-country in bad weather, land on unfamiliar airfields, and handle in-flight emergencies. They were ready to do whatever jobs the Army Air Forces needed them to do. But there was one massive problem. The WASPs weren't actually in the military. Congress had never officially made them part of the Army Air Forces. They were technically civil service employees attached to the military. This meant they didn't get military benefits, military insurance, or military recognition. If a WASP died in service, the government didn't even pay to ship her body home. Her fellow WASPs had to take up collections to pay for funeral expenses and to send her remains back to her family. And WASPs did die. 38 women lost their lives during WASP operations, about 1 out of every 29 pilots. They died in crashes, in mid-air collisions, when aircraft they were testing malfunctioned, when weather turned deadly. They died doing exactly the same jobs male pilots were doing, taking exactly the same risks. But because they weren't officially military, they didn't get military funerals or military honors. Their families didn't get the benefits that families of male pilots killed in service received. The discrimination didn't stop there. WASPs had to pay for their own transportation to training. They had to pay for their own uniforms, which they had to have specially made because the military didn't issue women's flight suits. They received less pay than male pilots doing identical jobs. When they were deployed to bases around the country, they often found that base commanders didn't want them there and made their lives difficult. At some bases, male pilots refused to fly with WASPs or take instruction from them. They claimed women pilots were dangerous, incompetent, or distracting. Some sabotaged missions by refusing to communicate properly or by filing false reports. The WASPs had to be not just as good as male pilots, but noticeably better, just to be taken seriously. But taken seriously they were, eventually, because their safety record and performance record were undeniable. WASPs flew over 60 million miles during the war. They ferried more than 12,000 aircraft from factories to military bases and ports. They towed targets for anti-aircraft gunnery practice, one of the most dangerous jobs in aviation, requiring flying straight and level while gunners fired live ammunition at targets trailing behind your plane. They test flew aircraft after major repairs or modifications, which meant being the first person to take a plane up after mechanics had worked on it, always a risky proposition. They flew every type of aircraft in the Army Air Force's inventory. Every single type. From tiny trainers to massive B-29 Super Fortresses, the biggest, most advanced bombers in the world. The B-29 was so complex and difficult to fly that many male pilots struggled with it. When the Air Forces wanted to prove the B-29 could be handled by regular pilots, not just elite bomber crews, they had WASPs demonstrate it. If women could fly the B-29, the thinking went, anybody could. One of the most famous WASP missions involved B-26 Marauders. The B-26 had a terrible reputation among pilots. It was fast but difficult to handle, especially during takeoff and landing. So many B-20 SIXs crashed during training that pilots nicknamed it the Widowmaker and refused to fly it. Morale in B-26 squadrons was terrible. So the Air Forces assigned WASPs to ferry B-20 SIXs, and they flew them perfectly. The message to male pilots was clear: if women can fly this plane safely, what's your excuse? Male pilot resistance to the B-26 disappeared almost overnight. Stories like that made WASPs legends within the Air Forces, even as they remained largely unknown to the American public. The program was shrouded in semi-secrecy. Most Americans had no idea women were flying military aircraft. The few who did know often didn't believe it. It was too far outside anything they could imagine. Living conditions for WASPs in training were Spartan. The barracks at Avenger Field were basic. The food was Army standard, which is to say, not great, and the heat in Texas summer was oppressive. The women lived in a military environment with regulations, inspections, and discipline. They marched, stood at attention, saluted, and followed orders, just like male aviation cadets. But they also formed an incredibly tight-knit community. They were pioneers, and they knew it. They supported each other through the brutal training, celebrated each other's successes, and mourned together when one of them died. The bonds formed at Avenger Field lasted lifetimes. By the time the WASP program ended in December 1944, 1,102 women had earned their silver pilot wings. They'd proven beyond any doubt that women could fly military aircraft as skillfully and safely as men. They'd made crucial contributions to the war effort. They demolished assumptions about gender and capability. And they'd been completely screwed over by the government they served, in ways we'll explore next. Let's talk about what WASPs actually did after training, because the missions were far more dangerous than most people realize, and the risks they took have been largely erased from popular memory. Start with target towing. This was one of the most common WASP assignments, and it was absolutely insane when you think about it. Here's how it worked. A WASP would take off in a plane pulling a long fabric sleeve, a target, on a cable trailing behind the aircraft. She'd fly to a designated area where anti-aircraft artillery units were training. Then she'd fly straight and level, at predictable altitudes and speeds, while those artillery units fired live ammunition at the target she was towing. Now, in theory, the gunners were aiming at the target, not at the plane. In practice, anti-aircraft gunnery is hard. Trainees make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes involved shells exploding way too close to the tow plane. WASPs flying target towing missions regularly came back with their planes riddled with holes from anti-aircraft fragments, or even direct hits that missed vital systems by sheer luck. Cornelia Ford, one of the original WFES members, was killed in March 1943 during a target towing mission when another aircraft collided with hers. She was the first American female pilot to die on active duty. Her death received minimal public attention because the program was still largely secret. Then there were the test flights. When aircraft came out of maintenance or had major modifications, someone had to test fly them to make sure the work was done correctly. This was incredibly dangerous because if the mechanics had made a mistake or missed something, the pilot was going to discover it mid-flight, possibly in catastrophic fashion. WASPs flew countless test flights, putting their lives on the line every time. Mabel Rawlinson was killed in August 1943 when the engine of the plane she was test flying caught fire. She was 25 years old. Margaret Oldenburg died in October 1943 when the plane she was ferrying developed mechanical problems and crashed. She was 23. The list goes on and on, 38 names total. 38 women who died doing military aviation work, who never got military honors, whose families got no military benefits, whose deaths were barely acknowledged publicly. Ferrying aircraft sounds safer than target towing or test flights, but it wasn't. WASPs ferried planes from factories to military bases all across the country, often through terrible weather, without the navigation aids we take for granted today. They flew using maps and visual landmarks, calculating headings and fuel consumption manually. If weather closed in or they got lost or ran into mechanical trouble, they were on their own. Evelyn Sharp, one of the most experienced WASPs, was killed in April 1944 when the P-38 Lightning fighter she was ferrying crashed in Pennsylvania. She had over 3,000 flight hours, more than most male pilots. It didn't matter. One mistake, one mechanical failure, one weather emergency, and you were dead. And here's something that makes the WASP story even more infuriating. While these women were flying dangerous missions and dying in service to their country, there was a coordinated campaign to disband the program. In 1944, as Allied victory started looking inevitable, male civilian pilots who'd been exempt from the draft because they were doing essential aviation work started lobbying Congress to shut down the WASPs. They wanted those flying jobs for themselves. The campaign against the WASPs was vicious. Opponents claimed women were taking jobs away from male pilots who needed work. They claimed WASPs were less capable than men, despite all evidence to the contrary. They claimed it was inappropriate for women to be doing military flying. They questioned WASPs' patriotism and motivations. Congress held hearings. Jacqueline Cochran and military officers testified about the program's success, about WASP's safety records and performance, about their crucial contributions. It didn't matter. In June 1944, Congress voted down a bill that would have made WASPs official military members. In December 1944, with the program unable to secure official military status, it was disbanded. All WASPs were sent home with thank you letters and not much else. No military benefits, no GI Bill, no veterans recognition. They were just dismissed, sent back to civilian life as if the previous 2 years had been some kind of wartime hobby rather than genuine military service. The injustice was compounded by secrecy. The WASPs were ordered not to talk about much of what they'd done. Intelligence concerns and military classifications meant many missions remained classified for decades. So these women went home, couldn't even fully explain to their families what they'd accomplished, and watched as their service was erased from public memory. It gets worse. The military sealed WASP records and classified them. For decades, researchers couldn't access them. When historians wrote about World War II aviation, WASPs were rarely mentioned. When they were mentioned, it was usually as a curious footnote, oh, and there were some women pilots too. The magnitude of their contributions was systematically minimized or ignored. Many WASPs spent decades fighting for recognition. They lobbied Congress for veteran status. They wrote letters, gave interviews, told their stories to anyone who would listen. For 33 years, they got nowhere. It wasn't until 1977, 33 years after the program ended, that Congress finally granted WASPs veteran status and official recognition of their military service. Even then, recognition was incomplete. In 2009, the WASPs were finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, Congress's highest civilian honor. President Barack Obama hosted surviving WASPs at the White House. But by then, most were in their 80s and 90s. Many had died without ever receiving proper recognition for their service. In 2016, the final indignity was corrected. WASPs were finally granted burial rights at Arlington National Cemetery. For decades, they'd been excluded even from that honor. It took until 2016, 72 years after the program ended, for the country to fully acknowledge that women who died in military aviation service deserved to be buried at Arlington alongside their male counterparts. Think about that timeline. Women flew dangerous military missions starting in 1942. The program ended in 1944. They weren't recognized as veterans until 1977. They didn't receive the Congressional Gold Medal until 2009. They weren't granted Arlington burial rights until 2016. That's 74 years of fighting for recognition and respect. The WASP story is American women's World War II service in microcosm. Incredible contributions, undeniable achievements, courage, skill, and sacrifice, followed by erasure, dismissal, and decades of having to fight for the recognition they should have received immediately. And WASPs weren't the only women in uniform facing these battles. Hundreds of thousands more served in the WWII, WAVES, and other women's military services, and their stories are equally complex and equally important. May 14, 1942. That's the date that changed everything for women and the U.S. military. That's when Congress established the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, later renamed the Women's Army Corps, or WAC. For the first time in American history, women could officially serve in the U.S. Army in roles beyond nursing. The reaction was, let's say mixed. That's being charitable. Many military leaders were openly hostile to the idea. Many politicians thought it was unnecessary or inappropriate. And a significant portion of the American public was convinced that women in uniform would undermine military effectiveness, destroy morale, and represent some kind of dangerous gender revolution. The woman who had to navigate all of this opposition was Oveta Kulpabi. She was appointed the first director of the WAC, which made her the first woman to lead a U.S. military organization. Hobby was a newspaper executive from Texas, politically connected and highly capable. She needed every bit of that capability because her job was essentially impossible: create a women's military organization from absolute scratch in the middle of a war while facing opposition from military brass, congressional skeptics, and public prejudice. The early months were chaotic. The Army had no infrastructure for training women soldiers, no barracks designed for women, no uniforms, no clear idea of what jobs women would actually do. Hobby and her staff had to figure out everything on the fly while the first recruits started arriving at training centers. Those first recruits were pioneers in every sense. They showed up at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, chosen as the first WAC training center in summer 1942, having no real idea what they were getting into. The Army crammed them into hastily converted facilities, issued them experimental uniforms that didn't fit right, and put them through a modified version of basic training that nobody had really finalized yet. The women learned to march, salute, stand at attention, follow orders. They studied military organization, regulations, and protocol. They learned military jobs: clerks, typists, telephone operators, mechanics, drivers. The training was designed to prepare them for the unglamorous reality of military support work. Nobody was preparing WACs for combat. That was absolutely off the table. But they were preparing them to take over stateside jobs that would free men for combat duty. Public reaction to the first WACs was fascinating and disturbing. Media coverage was intense. Every major newspaper and magazine ran stories about women soldiers. Some coverage was positive, portraying WAC recruits as patriotic heroes. But a lot of it was patronizing or sexist. Articles focused on what the women looked like in uniform, whether military life would make them mannish, whether they'd be able to handle military discipline. And then there was this slander campaign. Starting in 1943, ugly rumors about the WACs began circulating. The stories claimed that WAC recruits were prostitutes, that training centers were centers of sexual immorality, that the military was distributing contraceptives to WACs, that pregnancy rates among WACs were sky-high. None of this was true. It was coordinated disinformation, possibly started by Axis propaganda operations and amplified by Americans who opposed women's military service. The damage was severe. WAC recruitment dropped sharply as these rumors spread. Women who had been considering joining decided against it. Families pressured daughters and wives not to enlist. The Army launched investigations that conclusively proved the rumors were false, but the damage was done. The cloud of innuendo hung over the WACs for the rest of the war. Despite all this, the WAC, the organization, was renamed when Congress made it an official part of the Army in 1943 rather than just auxiliary status, grew to over 150,000 members by war's end. These women served in every major theater of World War II, North Africa, Europe, the Pacific. They worked as clerks, drivers, mechanics, communications specialists, supply personnel, intelligence analysts, and in hundreds of other military occupations. Their service was crucial. Army studies done during and after the war concluded that WACs free up men from stateside roles, allowing those men to be deployed overseas or into combat positions. One WAC could replace one male soldier in a non-combat role. It was that simple and that crucial. By 1945, there were WACs serving in every Army command in the United States and in every overseas theater where the Army operated. In New Guinea, North Africa, Italy, France, England, wherever American forces went, WACs went too. They worked in headquarters, handled classified documents, operated communications equipment, drove vehicles, maintained equipment, and performed hundreds of other essential functions. Without them, the Army's overseas operations would have been significantly degraded. And they did it all while facing discrimination that male soldiers didn't have to deal with. WACs were paid less than men of equivalent rank. They faced constant questions about their femininity and morality. They dealt with male soldiers who resented their presence or who saw them as sexual objects rather than fellow soldiers. They had to prove themselves every single day in ways men never did. The African American women who served in the WAC had it even worse. The WAC was racially segregated, like all U.S. military services during World War II. Black WACs were assigned to separate units, given different, usually worse, assignments, and faced discrimination from white WACs as well as from male soldiers. They were often assigned to the most menial jobs, cleaning, food service, laundry work, regardless of their qualifications or abilities. One unit story illustrates both the contributions and the discrimination Black WACs faced: the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, known as the 6888. This was the only all-black female battalion sent overseas during World War II. 855 women, commanded by Major Charity Adams, the first Black woman to achieve the rank of lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. Their mission was to clear a massive backlog of undelivered mail in the European theater. Millions of pieces of mail, letters, packages, photographs had piled up in warehouses, some sitting there for years. Mail to soldiers is crucial for morale. When troops aren't getting letters from home, when they don't know if their families are getting their letters, morale collapses. The military's motto for the 6,888th was simple: no mail, low morale. The 6,888th arrived in England in February 1945 and went to work in aircraft hangars filled floor to ceiling with mail bags. The conditions were awful. The hangars were unheated, poorly lit, cold, damp, and infested with rats. The women worked 8-hour shifts around the clock, processing mail addresses by hand, tracking down soldiers who had moved or been killed, and getting millions of pieces of mail to the right people. The Army estimated it would take 6 months to clear the backlog. The 6,888th did it in 3 months. Then they were sent to France to clear postal backlogs there. They processed an average of 65,000 pieces of mail per shift, mail addressed to Junior or Robert Smith, or just to units that had been disbanded or moved. They had to track down correct addresses using incomplete information, all while working in miserable conditions. They did all this while facing racial discrimination from the military and from British and French civilians. They dealt with segregated facilities. They faced hostility from white American troops. And they still got the job done, exceeding every expectation. The 6,888th returned to the United States in 1946 and was disbanded. For decades, their service was largely forgotten. It wasn't until 2009 that they received the Meritorious Unit Commendation. In 2022, Congress passed legislation awarding the Congressional Gold Medal to the surviving members of the 6,888th. As of 2025, only a handful of 6888 veterans were still alive to receive that recognition that should have come 80 years earlier. The WAC as a whole was deactivated after the war, then reactivated, then finally integrated into the regular Army in 1978 when all separate women's military branches were dissolved and women were fully integrated into the armed forces. But those World War II WACs, those pioneers who proved women could soldier, their legacy lived on in every woman who served in the military afterward. While the Army was figuring out what to do with the WAC, the Navy was creating its own women's service, the Waves. The acronym stood for Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, which was a mouthful, so everyone just called them WAVES. The program was established in July 1942, about 2 months after the WAC. The Navy's approach was different from the Army's in some important ways. First, the Navy positioned WAVES as an elite service. They recruited heavily from college campuses, looking for educated women with specific skills. They emphasized that WAVES would be doing intellectually demanding work, communications, intelligence, navigation instruction, technical training. This wasn't presented as a way for just any woman to serve. This was for the best and brightest. That elitism was intentional. The Navy brass thought that if they positioned the WAVES as high status, educated women doing important work, there'd be less resistance to the idea of women in naval service. They were probably right. The WAVES faced less of the crude slander that plagued the WAC, possibly because their public image was more respectable and upper class. But make no mistake, the Navy still didn't want women anywhere near ships or combat zones. WAVES were restricted to stateside duty for almost the entire war. They couldn't serve on ships, they couldn't serve overseas, they couldn't go anywhere near actual combat. They were support personnel, freeing up men for combat duty, same as the WAC, but they'd be doing it from bases in the continental United States. By the end of the war, 86,000 women had served in the WAVES. They worked as radio operators, cryptanalysts, air traffic controllers, aviation instructors, intelligence analysts, mechanics, and in dozens of other technical specialties. Some of the work they did was absolutely crucial to winning the war, even if they were doing it from offices in Washington or communications stations in California. One WAVE's story captures just how important their contributions were. Her name was Grace Hopper, and before the war, she was a mathematics professor at Vassar College with a PhD from Yale. When the war started, Hopper tried to join the Navy, but she was initially rejected. She was too old at 37, and she didn't weigh enough according to Navy standards. She kept pushing, got a waiver, and was finally accepted into the WAVES in December 1943. Lieutenant Grace Hopper was assigned to the Bureau of Ships Computation Project at Harvard University. Her job was to work on the Mark I computer, one of the world's first programmable digital computers. The Mark I was a massive electromechanical calculating machine, 51 feet long and 8 feet tall, designed to perform complex mathematical calculations for the Navy. It was used for everything from calculating ballistic firing tables to working on the Manhattan Project. Hopper became one of the Mark I's primary programmers. She wrote the first computer programming manual. She developed new ways to make the machine more efficient. She pioneered concepts that would eventually lead to modern programming languages. And she did all this while facing skepticism from male colleagues who didn't think a woman could understand complex mathematics or computer science. After the war, Hopper continued her work in computing and eventually became Rear Admiral Grace Hopper, one of the most important figures in the history of computer science. She invented the first compiler for a programming language. She was instrumental in developing COBOL, one of the first high-level programming languages, which is still in use today in some systems. She served in the Navy until 1986, retiring at age 79 as the oldest commissioned officer in the service. A Navy destroyer, USS Hopper, is named in her honor. But Hopper wasn't the only WAVE doing groundbreaking work. Thousands of WAVES worked as cryptanalysts, codebreakers, attacking Japanese and German codes. Some worked at the Navy's Communications Intelligence Facility in Washington. Others worked at listening stations along both coasts, intercepting enemy radio transmissions and forwarding them for analysis. The work was classified at the highest levels. WAVES working in cryptanalysis had to pass extensive background checks. They had to sign secrecy agreements promising never to discuss their work. And they kept those promises for decades. Many Waves code breakers never told even their families what they'd done during the war. The work remained classified for decades after the war ended. What we know now is that Waves cryptanalysts made crucial contributions to breaking Japanese codes. They worked on the Japanese Naval Code JN-25, which gave American commanders vital intelligence about Japanese ship movements and operations. They provided intelligence that helped the Navy win crucial battles in the Pacific. Their work literally saved American lives and shortened the war. But during the war and for years afterward, nobody outside classified circles knew any of this. The Waves were just women doing mysterious technical work in Navy facilities. The magnitude of their contributions remained hidden. Waves also served as aviation instructors, teaching male pilots how to fly using navigation instruments, radio communications, and instrument approaches. Some male pilots initially refused to take instruction from women. They got over it pretty quickly when they realized the Wave instructors knew their stuff better than many male instructors did. Link trainers, flight simulators, were operated by Waves, putting male pilots through simulated emergencies and instrument approaches. Waves worked in control towers, managing air traffic at busy naval air stations. They maintained aircraft, inspected parachutes, and performed dozens of other technical jobs that male personnel had been doing before the war. At the Navy's Ordnance Testing Facility, Waves tested bomb and torpedo fuses, did ballistics calculations, and helped develop new weapon systems. At naval hospitals, Waves worked as physical therapists, X-ray technicians, and laboratory technicians. They operated complex medical equipment and assisted in treating wounded sailors and Marines. The range of work Waves did was enormous, but all of it had one thing in common: it freed up male sailors for combat duty. Every Wave working stateside meant one more man could be assigned to a ship or a combat unit. The Navy calculated that each Wave freed up 1.5 male sailors because women could do the work more efficiently than many of the men who'd been doing it before. Like the WWII, the Waves faced discrimination and skepticism. Male sailors sometimes resented them. Some Navy officers thought women had no place in naval service. And Waves were paid less than male sailors of equivalent rank, despite doing the same work. The Waves were also overwhelmingly white. The Navy refused to accept black women into the Waves until 1944, and even then, it was only after intense pressure from civil rights organizations and from the White House. When the Navy finally did start accepting black women, it recruited only 72 of them during the entire war. They were assigned to segregated facilities and given limited assignments. The Navy's racism was even more blatant than the Army's. But despite all the obstacles and discrimination, Waves proved themselves just as thoroughly as WACs and WASPs had. By war's end, 18,000 Waves were working in aviation specialties. 5,000 were working in communications and intelligence. Thousands more were working in medicine, supply, administration, and technical fields. They'd proven that women could do highly technical, intellectually demanding military work just as well as men. When the war ended, the Waves were retained, unlike many other women's war programs that were disbanded. The Navy realized that women's service was too valuable to give up entirely. The Waves continued as a separate women's service until 1978, when the Navy fully integrated women into its regular forces. Every woman who serves in the Navy today is the inheritor of what those World War II Waves started. They opened doors that would never fully close. They proved capabilities that could never be denied again. They changed the Navy permanently. But as important as the Waves' contributions were, there was another group of women doing intelligence work that was even more secret, even more crucial, and even more completely erased from public memory for decades after the war. Picture this scenario. It's early 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor. You're a young woman, fresh out of college with a mathematics degree. You're living with your parents, working as a school teacher, and wondering how you can contribute to the war effort. Then you receive a mysterious letter. It doesn't say much, just that your skills might be useful for important government work in Washington. The letter urges you not to discuss it with anyone. It gives you a phone number to call and a date for an interview. You go to Washington. The interview is strange. They ask you mathematical puzzles, logic problems, questions about your ability to keep secrets. They tell you almost nothing about what the job would actually involve, except that it's important war work and it's classified. A few weeks later, another letter arrives. You've been accepted. Report to Arlington Hall in Virginia. When you arrive, you discover you're one of hundreds, eventually thousands, of young women being recruited for something called signals intelligence. Only then do you learn what the job actually is. You're going to be breaking enemy codes. Japanese codes, German codes, the secret communications of America's enemies. Your math skills, your attention to detail, your ability to spot patterns, these are exactly what the government needs for cryptanalysis. This is how over 10,000 American women became code breakers during World War II. Most were young, most had college educations, and almost none had any background in cryptanalysis when they started. They were teachers, mathematicians, musicians, linguists, women with analytical minds who could be trained to do one of the most important jobs of the war. Arlington Hall, a former girls' school in Virginia, became the Army's Signals Intelligence Headquarters in June 1942. Within months, the facility was packed with over 1,000 women, WACs, and civilian employees, working in shifts around the clock to break Japanese codes. The building was surrounded by barbed wire and guards. Everyone who worked there had to pass extensive background checks. Nobody on the outside knew what happened inside those walls. The Navy had its own code-breaking operation in Washington, and it also recruited thousands of women. Some worked at the main Navy Department building. Others were assigned to listening stations where they intercepted Japanese naval communications and forwarded them to Washington for analysis. What these women did was intellectually brutal. Breaking codes isn't like solving a puzzle where you know there's a solution and you just have to find it. It's more like solving a puzzle where you're not sure there is a solution, where you don't know what the puzzle is supposed to look like when it's finished, and where you have to invent the tools to solve it as you go. They worked with encrypted messages, gibberish, random-looking sequences of numbers or letters. Their job was to find patterns, spot regularities, discover the mathematical systems that had been used to encrypt the messages, and then reverse engineer those systems to decrypt future messages. It required extraordinary mathematical ability, infinite patience, and the kind of mental stamina that let you stare at columns of numbers for hours looking for patterns that might not even be there. And they were brilliant at it. And Kara Christie, working at Arlington Hall, helped break Japanese Army codes that revealed troop movements and battle plans. Her work provided intelligence that helped American forces in the Pacific. After the war, Kara Christie continued working in signals intelligence and eventually became the deputy director of the National Security Agency, the highest civilian position in the agency. Genevieve Grotjen-Feinstein made the crucial break that cracked the Japanese diplomatic code called Purple. This gave American intelligence the ability to read high-level Japanese diplomatic communications. The intelligence gained from Purple intercepts was invaluable throughout the war. Virginia Dare Adderholt worked on another Japanese code called JH. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, it was Adderholt who decrypted the message. She was the first person in America to read Japan's surrender communication. Thousands more women whose names we'll never know did similar work. They tracked German U-boats in the Atlantic, helping the Navy protect convoys. They decoded Japanese messages about aircraft production, giving American planners intelligence about enemy capabilities. They broke codes used by Japanese merchant ships, allowing American submarines to hunt them more effectively. The women working on this secret war built what one historian called a cryptanalytic assembly line. They developed systematic methods for attacking codes, dividing the work into stages so that dozens of people could work on different parts of the same problem simultaneously. They managed rooms full of complex mechanical and electrical decryption equipment. They trained new recruits. They supervised teams. They did administrative work that kept the entire operation functioning. And they did it all in secrecy. They couldn't tell their families what they did for a living. They couldn't discuss their work with anyone outside their immediate work group. When they went home at the end of the day, they had to act like they'd been doing boring clerical work, not breaking codes that affected the outcome of battles. The security restrictions were intense. Armed guards watched the entrances. Everyone wore identification badges. Documents were classified and had to be locked up at the end of each shift. Trash was burned to prevent any classified material from being discarded. Phone calls were monitored. Mail was censored. The entire operation existed in a bubble of secrecy. Inside that bubble, something remarkable happened. Women who had been told their entire lives that mathematics was too difficult for them, that their brains weren't suited for complex analytical work, were doing some of the most advanced mathematical analysis being done anywhere in the world. They were breaking codes that German and Japanese cryptographers had designed to be unbreakable. They were providing intelligence that commanders described as decisive. And almost nobody knew about it. The work was so classified that even after the war ended, the women couldn't talk about it. The government kept code-breaking operations classified for decades. Files were sealed. Records were restricted. The women who'd done this crucial work went back to civilian life with instructions to never discuss what they'd done. Many of them kept that secret for 30, 40, even 50 years. They never told their husbands, their children, their friends. They carried the knowledge of their wartime service silently, unable to share it even when they desperately wanted to. The consequences of this secrecy were profound and long-lasting. When historians wrote about World War II in the decades after the war, code breaking was barely mentioned. When it was discussed, it was usually attributed to brilliant male mathematicians and engineers. The women who'd done most of the actual work were invisible. It wasn't until the 1970s and 80s, when the government finally began declassifying World War II intelligence operations, that the full story started to emerge. Researchers going through newly released documents were shocked to discover the extent of women's involvement in cryptanalysis. The scale of women's contributions had been completely hidden. Even then, many of the women themselves were hesitant to talk. They'd spent so many years keeping secrets that it was hard to break the habit. They'd signed secrecy agreements that carried criminal penalties. They weren't sure what they were allowed to say. Some feared they could still be prosecuted if they said the wrong thing. Gradually, though, the stories came out. Journalists started tracking down former codebreakers and recording their oral histories. Historians began writing about the code girls and their contributions. Museums and archives started collecting documents and artifacts related to women's code-breaking work. What emerged was a story of extraordinary achievement that had been hidden for 40 years. These women had provided intelligence that affected crucial battles. They'd shortened the war. They'd saved countless American lives. And they'd done it all while facing the same discrimination that women in factories and military uniforms faced. They were paid less than male cryptanalysts doing the same work. They were promoted more slowly or not at all. Some male colleagues resented their presence or assumed they were only capable of doing routine, mechanical tasks. The women had to prove themselves constantly, and even when they did, they often didn't get full credit for their achievements. African American women who worked in code breaking faced additional discrimination. The facilities were segregated. Black women worked in separate spaces, used separate bathrooms, ate in separate cafeterias. They faced discrimination from white female colleagues as well as from men. And like all women code breakers, they couldn't talk about their work, which meant they couldn't even defend themselves when people assumed they were doing menial jobs. After the war, many women code breakers wanted to continue working in signals intelligence. Some were able to. The newly formed National Security Agency hired women for cryptanalysis work, but many others were pushed out to make way for returning male veterans. The skills they developed, the expertise they'd gained, none of that mattered when the priority was finding jobs for men. Some women went back to teaching or secretarial work, using none of their cryptanalysis skills. Some got married and became housewives, putting their wartime service behind them as completely as they could. The government didn't help them transition to civilian careers. There was no recognition, no veteran status for civilian code breakers, no GI Bill benefits. They just went home. The psychological impact of this erasure was significant. These women knew they'd done important work. They knew they'd made crucial contributions to winning the war. But they couldn't talk about it, and the wider world acted like it had never happened. Imagine carrying that knowledge silently for decades, watching documentaries and reading history books that ignored or minimized what you'd done. In the 1990s and 2000s, as more information was declassified and more women felt comfortable sharing their stories, there was a push for recognition. The National Cryptologic Museum created exhibits about World War II codebreakers, including extensive sections on women's contributions. The National Security Agency sponsored reunions where former codebreakers could finally meet and talk openly about their wartime work. Books were written. Liza Mundy's Code Girls, published in 2017, brought the story to a wider audience. Young people learned for the first time that their grandmothers or great-grandmothers had been code breakers during World War II. The women finally got to tell their stories. But by then, most of them were in their 80s and 90s. Many had already died without ever receiving public recognition for their service. The recognition came too late for too many. The code-breaking story illustrates one of the most frustrating patterns in how we remember women's World War II service. Women did crucial, sometimes decisive work. They proved themselves capable of highly technical, intellectually demanding jobs that conventional wisdom said they couldn't do. They made contributions that military leaders at the time acknowledged were essential to victory. And then that work was classified, hidden, minimized, or simply forgotten. The women who did it were told to be quiet, to go home, to not make a fuss. And when recognition finally came decades later, it came too late to matter for most of them. This pattern shows up again and again in women's World War II history. Whether it was factory workers, military service members, pilots, or code breakers, their contributions were enormous, their achievements were undeniable, and then they were systematically erased from public memory. Understanding why that happened requires looking at what came after the war, when millions of women who'd spent years doing men's work were told it was time to go back home and let the men have their jobs back. Here's what the propaganda posters never showed. A woman wakes up at 5 in the morning. She makes breakfast for her 2 children, gets them dressed, packs their lunches. She drops them off at a neighbor's house. There's no childcare available, so neighbors help each other out. She takes a crowded bus to the shipyard, arriving just in time for her 7 a.m. shift. She works 8 hours welding hull plates. It's physically demanding, dangerous work. By mid-afternoon, she's exhausted. But her shift ends at 3, and she has to pick up her children, get home, and make dinner. There's no frozen food, no microwave, no convenience anything. She has to cook from scratch, using whatever she can get with her ration stamps. Meat is rationed. Sugar is rationed. Butter is rationed. After dinner, there's cleaning up, getting the children bathed and into bed, doing laundry by hand, mending clothes, preparing for the next day. By the time she falls into bed, it's 10 or 11 at night. She'll get 6 hours of sleep if she's lucky, and then she'll do it all again tomorrow. This was the reality for millions of American women during World War II. The government propaganda focused entirely on their paid work, the factories, the military service, the war effort contribution. What it completely ignored was that most of these women were also still responsible for all the domestic work they'd been doing before the war. Nobody was offering to take over cooking, cleaning, childcare, and household management while women worked in war industries. The double burden was crushing. Women were working 40 to 60-hour weeks and demanding industrial jobs, then coming home to another 40 to 60 hours of unpaid domestic labor. They were doing 2 full-time jobs, and society acted like this was completely normal and expected. Childcare was a massive problem. Before the war, most mothers didn't work outside the home, so childcare infrastructure barely existed. When millions of mothers suddenly needed childcare so they could work in war industries, there was a scramble to create it. The federal government eventually responded with the Lanham Act, which provided funding for childcare centers near war production facilities. At its peak, the program funded about 3,000 childcare centers serving roughly 600,000 children. These centers provided full-day care, meals, and even some medical services. For women who had access to them, Lanham Act centers were lifesavers. But here's the problem: 600,000 children is a tiny fraction of the children who needed care. There were millions of mothers working in war industries. Most had no access to federally funded childcare. They had to patch together informal arrangements, neighbors watching each other's kids, older children taking care of younger siblings, relatives helping out. Some women had no choice but to leave children home alone while they worked. The Lanham Act program was also controversial. Many people opposed federal childcare on principle. They argued it was the government interfering in family life, that it would encourage mothers to neglect their children, that it was a step toward communism. The program was always underfunded and politically vulnerable. As soon as the war ended, federal childcare funding was cut off completely. The centers closed. Women who'd relied on them were left with no options. Beyond childcare, there was the simple logistics of running a household in wartime. Rationing made everything harder. Every family had ration books with stamps for meat, sugar, butter, coffee, gasoline, shoes, and other goods. Women had to plan meals around what they could actually get with their stamps. They had to stand in line at stores, sometimes for hours, hoping items wouldn't run out before they got to the front. The government encouraged families to plant victory gardens to grow their own food and reduce demand on the rationed food supply. So on top of everything else, many women were also gardening, planting, weeding, harvesting, and preserving food. It was more work, but it helped stretch ration stamps further. Women were also expected to conserve and recycle everything. Scrap drives collected metal, rubber, paper, and other materials for war production. Women saved bacon grease, which was used to make explosives, flattened tin cans, collected newspapers, and saved every scrap of usable material. This was patriotic duty, but it was also more work. And then there was the emotional labor. Many women working in war industries had husbands or sons serving overseas. They carried constant worry about their safety. They wrote letters, sent packages, and tried to maintain some connection despite months or years of separation. They dealt with the fear that every knock on the door might be a telegram announcing that their loved one had been killed. Some women were also dealing with wounded veterans who came home during the war. They became caregivers to husbands or sons with physical injuries or psychological trauma. This was before widespread understanding of PTSD, before comprehensive VA services, before much support existed for families dealing with war trauma. Women just did their best to cope. The physical toll of all this was enormous. Women working in factories were suffering industrial injuries, burns, crushed fingers, exposure to toxic chemicals. Then they'd go home and do housework that was also physically demanding in the 1940s. Laundry meant hauling water, scrubbing clothes by hand, running them through a wringer, hanging them to dry. Cooking meant standing for hours at a stove. Cleaning meant scrubbing floors on hands and knees. Women got sick, exhausted, and injured, but they couldn't take time off. The factory needed them. Their families needed them. The war effort needed them. So they pushed through pain and exhaustion and kept working. The psychological toll was also severe. Women were constantly being told contradictory things. Go to work, it's your patriotic duty. But don't neglect your children, that's un-American. Be strong and capable in the factory. But remain feminine and attractive so you don't become mannish. Work hard and prove yourself. But remember that this is temporary and you'll happily give up your job when the war ends. The messaging was impossible to navigate. Women couldn't win. If they focused on paid work, they were criticized for neglecting their families. If they focused on family, they were criticized for not supporting the war effort enough. The expectation was that they'd do everything perfectly, all the time, without complaint. Some women cracked under the pressure. Absenteeism and turnover were problems in some war industries, usually because women were dealing with sick children, family emergencies, or simple physical and mental exhaustion. Factory managers often responded by criticizing women as unreliable workers, completely ignoring the impossible burdens women were carrying. But what's remarkable is how many women managed to sustain this double burden for years. From 1942 to 1945, millions of women worked full-time in war industries while also managing households and raising children. They proved they could handle extraordinary workloads and multiple responsibilities simultaneously. That experience changed them. They discovered capabilities they hadn't known they had. They developed confidence and skills. They learned they could handle situations they thought were impossible. And when the war ended and they were told to go back to being housewives again, some of them weren't quite ready to accept that. Let's be direct about something the propaganda never mentioned. Women working in war industries faced constant sexual harassment, and there was almost nothing they could do about it. Male coworkers made sexually explicit comments. Supervisors touched women without permission, propositioned them, made their work environments hostile. Women who rejected these advances sometimes faced retaliation, bad assignments, unfair performance reviews, or even firing. Women who complained were told they were oversensitive, couldn't take a joke, or were troublemakers. This wasn't occasional or isolated. Oral histories and memoirs from women who worked in war industries make clear that sexual harassment was pervasive and normalized. Men felt entitled to comment on women's bodies, to touch them, to make crude jokes. The attitude was that women who'd chosen to work in men's spaces had to expect this kind of treatment. Some women fought back. They filed complaints, challenged supervisors, or organized with other women to create safer conditions. Sometimes they got support from unions or from more enlightened managers, but often they didn't. Often they were told to toughen up, to ignore it, to focus on their work. The harassment was worse for African American women. They faced both sexual harassment and racial harassment, often simultaneously. White male coworkers made racist and sexist comments. Some supervisors saw Black women as particularly vulnerable targets because they knew these women had even less recourse than white women did. Black women who complained faced not just retaliation at work, but also potential violence from racist coworkers or community members. And then there was the pay gap. Despite government policies saying women should receive equal pay for equal work, it almost never happened in practice. Employers used creative strategies to avoid paying women fairly. They'd reclassify jobs when women took them over, giving them new titles that paid less. A job called welder that paid $1 an hour when a man did it became welder helper, paying 70 cents an hour when a woman did it, even though the actual work was identical. They'd claim that because women couldn't do every single task a male worker did, maybe they couldn't lift as much weight or couldn't do certain physically demanding tasks, they didn't deserve full pay. Even if 95% of the job was identical, and they performed that 95% as well as or better than men. They'd promote men faster, so even if starting pay was equal, women quickly fell behind. A woman who'd been doing a job for 2 years might still be making entry-level wages, while a man who'd been doing the same job for 6 months got promoted and received a raise. On average, women in war industries earned about 60% of what men earned. In some industries and some jobs, the gap was even wider. The economic discrimination was blatant and systematic. Some women challenged this. The United Electrical Workers Union, which represented workers in many electrical equipment and aircraft plants, fought aggressively for equal pay. They filed grievances, organized protests, and in some cases forced employers to narrow the gender pay gap significantly. But most industries didn't have strong union representation for women, and most women had no effective way to fight pay discrimination. The government didn't help. The War Labor Board had a policy supporting equal pay for equal work, but it rarely enforced it. When women filed complaints about unequal pay, the complaints often went nowhere. Employers would provide some excuse for why the work wasn't actually equal, and the board would accept it. This economic discrimination had real consequences. Women supporting families on unequal wages struggled financially. Single mothers, widows, and women whose husbands were serving overseas and sending home minimal military pay, they were doing crucial war work and still barely scraping by because they were being paid a fraction of what men earned. And society blamed them for struggling. If a woman couldn't afford childcare on her discriminatory wages, she was criticized for neglecting her children. If she couldn't afford good food or adequate clothing on her unequal pay, she was judged as a bad homemaker. The system shortchanged women and then criticized them for the consequences of being shortchanged. African American women faced an even worse situation. They were paid less than white women, who were already paid less than men. A black woman doing factory work might earn 50% or less of what a white man earned for identical work. The compounding of racial and gender discrimination meant black women were at the absolute bottom of the pay scale despite often working the hardest and most dangerous jobs. Some black women organized to fight this. They worked with civil rights organizations and sympathetic unions to challenge both racial and gender discrimination. They filed complaints, organized protests, and pushed for change. Progress was slow and limited, but they achieved some victories. The discrimination extended beyond pay and harassment. Women faced discriminatory policies about marriage and pregnancy. Many employers fired women who got married under the assumption that married women didn't need to work or would soon quit anyway. Women who became pregnant were almost always fired immediately. There was no such thing as maternity leave or job protection for pregnant workers. This put women in impossible positions. If they got pregnant during the war, whether by choice or not, they lost their jobs and their income. They were shut out of war work entirely. The message was clear: Women could contribute to the war effort only as long as they didn't have any needs or life circumstances that complicated their availability. Bathroom facilities were inadequate. Factories built for all-male workforces had minimal bathroom facilities for women. Women sometimes had to walk long distances to find a restroom, cutting into their break time. Some facilities were unsanitary or poorly maintained. This sounds like a minor issue until you're a woman working a 10-hour shift with 2 bathroom breaks and the nearest women's restroom is a 5-minute walk away. Safety equipment didn't fit properly. Boots, gloves, goggles, and coveralls were all designed for male bodies. Women made do with equipment that was too large, that didn't provide proper protection, that was awkward to work in. Some women were injured because safety equipment didn't fit properly. But changing this would have required acknowledging that women weren't just temporary workers and actually investing in proper equipment for them, which most employers refused to do. The cumulative effect of all this discrimination, sexual harassment, pay inequality, discriminatory policies, inadequate facilities, was a work environment that was actively hostile to women even as the government was running propaganda campaigns celebrating women's war work. Women succeeded despite all this, not because the system supported them. They achieved remarkable things while facing obstacles that male workers didn't have to deal with. That makes their achievements even more impressive and the system's failure to recognize and reward those achievements even more infuriating. And all of this, the double burden, the harassment, the pay discrimination, the hostile work environments, needs to be understood as context for what happened when the war ended and women were told it was time to go home. August 14, 1945. Victory over Japan Day, VJ Day. The war was finally over. Americans poured into the streets celebrating. In Times Square, a sailor kissed a nurse in what would become one of the most iconic photographs of the 20th century. Across the country, there was joy, relief, and overwhelming gratitude that the nightmare was finally ending. For women working in war industries, that day marked something else entirely. It marked the beginning of the end of their employment. The backlash started almost immediately. Within weeks of VJ Day, factories started laying off women workers. The official reason was that defense contracts were being canceled, production was ramping down, and there simply wasn't as much work. But that wasn't the whole story. Because while women were being laid off by the tens of thousands, those same factories were planning to hire returning veterans, men, to fill peacetime production jobs. The pattern was clear. Lay off the women first, then hire men. Seniority didn't matter. Job performance didn't matter. Women who'd worked in war factories since 1942 were being let go while men who'd never worked in the factory at all were being hired. The message was unmistakable. Women's work was never meant to be permanent. Now that the emergency was over, it was time for women to go home and let men have the jobs. Some women wanted to go home. They'd taken factory jobs out of patriotic duty or economic necessity during the war, and they were ready to return to domestic life. They'd been carrying the double burden for years, and the prospect of only having to manage a household instead of a household and a full-time job was appealing. For these women, the end of war work was a relief. But many other women wanted to keep working. They discovered that they liked earning their own income, that they liked the challenge and satisfaction of industrial work, that they liked the independence that came with a paycheck. They'd been told repeatedly during the war that they were doing crucial, important work. They'd proven they could do it as well as or better than men. Why should they give it up just because the war was over? The answer, society made clear, was that their wartime work had only ever been acceptable because it was temporary and necessary for victory. Now that neither condition applied, women working in factories or doing men's jobs was once again inappropriate, unnecessary, and threatening to the social order. The propaganda machine that had celebrated Rosie the Riveter and urged women into war work now pivoted 180 degrees. Suddenly, magazine articles and government messaging emphasized that women's true fulfillment came from being wives and mothers. Women who kept working were portrayed as selfish, as taking jobs away from men who needed them to support families, as threatening American prosperity and family stability. This shift was jarring for women who'd spent years being told their work was essential. They'd been patriots and heroes in 1943. By 1946, they were problems that needed to be solved. The layoffs were brutal and systematic. By the end of 1945, just 4 months after VJ Day, over 1 million women had been laid off from war industry jobs. By 1946, that number had grown to over 2 million. The percentage of women in manufacturing dropped from its wartime high back toward pre-war levels. Some women fought back. There were protests, picket lines, and appeals to unions and government agencies. Some women filed complaints alleging discrimination, but they had little recourse. Employers had the right to lay off workers when production decreased, and they exercised that right selectively to push women out first. Unions, which had supported women during the war, largely abandoned them after VJ Day. Union leadership was overwhelmingly male, and their priority was protecting jobs for men. When women tried to use seniority rules to keep their jobs, unions often sided with employers who wanted to hire male veterans instead. The GI Bill compounded the problem. Returning veterans got access to education, job training, housing loans, and business loans. The GI Bill was one of the most transformative pieces of social legislation in American history, creating opportunities for millions of veterans to build middle-class lives. But women who'd served in war industries got nothing comparable. They'd been civilians doing war work, so they weren't eligible for veteran benefits. They were just let go, with no support for transitioning back to whatever came next. Women who'd served in military uniform fared slightly better, but not by much. The WWII, WWII, and other women's services were drastically reduced in size after the war. Thousands of women who'd served in uniform were discharged. Unlike male veterans, they faced significant barriers to using GI Bill benefits. Many colleges and training programs weren't set up to accept women. Employers often wouldn't hire women veterans for the kinds of jobs male veterans got. They'd served their country in uniform, but society treated them as less deserving than male veterans. The WASPs had the worst of it. As we discussed earlier, they were deactivated in December 1944 and sent home with no benefits at all. They weren't veterans. They weren't eligible for the GI Bill. They just got thank you letters and dismissal. What happened after World War II wasn't just a return to normal. It was an active campaign to push women back into domestic roles and erase their wartime achievements from public memory. Popular culture reinforced this. The 1950s saw an explosion of media celebrating the suburban housewife as the ideal of American womanhood. Television shows, magazines, advertising, all of it portrayed women's fulfillment as coming exclusively from marriage, children, and homemaking. Women who'd built bombers and broken codes were now supposed to find satisfaction in finding the perfect floor wax and making the perfect meatloaf. The baby boom was both cause and effect of this shift. Millions of couples who delayed having children during the war now started families. Birth rates surged. Women who might have continued working often found themselves with multiple young children and overwhelming social pressure to stay home and raise them properly. The cultural narrative became that women's wartime work had been a temporary aberration, a necessary sacrifice during the emergency, but not something to be repeated or celebrated. Some histories written in the 1950s barely mentioned women's war work at all. When it was mentioned, it was often trivialized or romanticized into something cute rather than crucial. But here's the thing that cultural narrative tried to erase. Women's wartime experiences had changed them. They'd proven to themselves that they could do far more than society had told them was possible. They'd experienced economic independence. They developed skills and confidence. They'd seen that the rules about what women could and couldn't do weren't natural laws. They were just social conventions that could be changed. Not every woman who worked during the war came away with a feminist consciousness. Many internalized the messages about returning to domestic life and did so without significant resistance. But enough women had been changed by their experiences that the groundwork was laid for everything that came later. The civil rights movement, the second wave feminist movement, the continuing push for gender equality, all of it had roots in what women learned about themselves during World War II. When women in the 1960s and 70s started demanding equal rights and opportunities, they were building on the foundation that World War II women had established, even if that foundation had been buried and forgotten. So, what's the real legacy of American women in World War II? If their achievements were minimized, their contributions forgotten, and their gains rolled back after 1945, did any of it actually matter in the long run? The answer is absolutely yes, but not in the neat, linear way we might want history to work. First, the doors that opened during World War II never fully closed again. Yes, millions of women were pushed out of war industries after VJ Day, but women's workforce participation never dropped back to pre-war levels. By 1950, about 32% of women were in the paid workforce, compared to 25% in 1940. That doesn't sound like much, but it represented millions of women who stayed in or returned to paid work despite enormous social pressure to stay home. More importantly, the composition of the female workforce changed. Before the war, working women were overwhelmingly young and single. After the war, married women and mothers increasingly worked outside the home. The cultural taboo against married women working had been cracked, and it never fully reasserted itself. By 1960, nearly 40% of married women were in the workforce. That shift started during World War II. Second, women's military service became permanent. Yes, the WAC and waves were drastically reduced after the war. But unlike after World War I, they weren't eliminated. Congress passed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act in 1948, making women a permanent part of the U.S. military. The numbers were small and the restrictions were extensive. Women couldn't serve in combat, couldn't command men, faced strict limits on rank and career advancement. But the principle was established. Women could serve in uniform. That principle, once established, expanded over time until today women serve in every branch of the military, in combat roles, at the highest ranks, including as four-star generals. Third, World War II created a generation of women who knew from personal experience that they were capable of far more than society told them they could do. Most of these women didn't become activists or feminists. Most of them followed the script society gave them in the 1950s: marriage, children, suburban life. But they raised daughters, and those daughters grew up hearing stories about what mom did during the war. They grew up knowing that their mothers had built airplanes, served in uniform, broken codes, flown military aircraft. When those daughters came of age in the 1960s and 70s and started demanding equal opportunities, they weren't asking for something unprecedented. They were asking for what their mothers had proven was possible. The second wave feminist movement drew directly. When those daughters came of age in the 1960s and 70s and started demanding equal opportunities, they weren't asking for something unprecedented. They were asking for what their mothers had proven was possible. The second wave feminist movement drew directly on the experiences and lessons of World War II women. Betty Friedan, whose 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, helped launch second-wave feminism, was herself a World War II journalist who'd covered women's labor issues. The National Organization for Women, founded in 1966, had among its early members many women who'd worked in war industries or served in uniform during the war. They brought that experience with them into the feminist movement. Fourth, World War II permanently changed Americans' understanding of what women could do. Yes, that understanding was suppressed and minimized in the 1950s, but it never completely disappeared. The images of women welding, flying planes, serving in uniform, they remained in the culture. When debates about women's capabilities came up in later decades, people could point to World War II and say, "We know women can do this because they already did it." The resistance to women's equality after World War II also taught important lessons. Women who'd been pushed out of good jobs in 1945 and 46 understood viscerally that temporary gains could be taken away. They understood that achieving something once didn't guarantee keeping it. When the women's movement of the 60s and 70s fought for permanent legal protections, the Equal Pay Act of 1963, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title IX in 1972, they were working to prevent what happened after World War II from happening again. Fifth, World War II created institutional changes that outlasted the war itself. The principle that women could serve in the military became permanent law in 1948. That principle, once established, expanded continuously. In 1976, women were admitted to military service academies. In 1994, the combat exclusion policy was partially lifted. In 2013, all combat positions were open to women. In 2016, the first women graduated from Army Ranger School. Today, women serve as fighter pilots, special operations soldiers, and at the highest ranks of military leadership. None of that would have been possible without World War II women proving it could be done. They opened a door that subsequent generations of women pushed wider and wider until it couldn't be closed. Sixth, the economic contributions of World War II women demonstrated something that business and industry couldn't ignore forever. Women represented an enormous pool of talent and capability that was being wasted by discrimination and exclusion. The productivity data from war industries, the success of programs like the WASP and the Codebreakers, all of it proved that excluding women from jobs and opportunities was economically irrational. That argument eventually won converts in business and government. Finally, the stories themselves matter. As World War II women's experiences have been recovered and told over the past few decades, they've inspired new generations. Young women today who learn about WASP pilots or Codebreakers or the 6888 understand that women have always been capable of extraordinary things, even when society tried to prevent them from proving it. Museums and memorials have played a crucial role in this recovery. The Rosie the Riveter National Historical Park in Richmond, California, preserves the site where thousands of women built Liberty ships. The National WASP World War II Museum in Sweetwater, Texas, tells the story of women pilots. The National Cryptologic Museum includes extensive exhibits on Code Girls. These institutions ensure that future generations will know these stories. Educational curricula have gradually incorporated more content about women's World War II service. Students today are far more likely to learn about the WAC, waves, and WASPs than students were 30 or 40 years ago. The stories are becoming part of the standard narrative of World War II history, not footnotes or curiosities. Popular culture has also begun telling these stories. Films like Hidden Figures about African American women mathematicians at NASA draw directly on the World War II tradition of women proving themselves in technical fields despite discrimination. The 2020 Netflix film, The 6888, brought the story of the Black Women's Postal Battalion to a wide audience. These cultural representations matter because they shape how people understand history and possibility. So when we ask what the legacy of American women in World War II actually is, the answer is complex but ultimately hopeful. Their immediate gains were rolled back after 1945. They faced discrimination, erasure, and decades of having their contributions minimized or forgotten. But the doors they opened never fully closed. The capabilities they demonstrated could never be entirely denied. The changes they initiated continued, slowly and against resistance, but continued nonetheless. Every woman who serves in the military today, every woman who works in a traditionally male field, every woman who fights for equal pay and equal opportunity, they're walking through doors that World War II women first pushed open. The path from 1942 to today wasn't direct or smooth. There were setbacks, defeats, and long periods where progress seemed impossible. But the fundamental transformation that began during World War II never completely reversed. That's the real story of American women in World War II. Not the simplified poster of Rosie the Riveter. Not the mythology of women cheerfully going to work and then cheerfully going home. But the complicated, difficult, inspiring reality of millions of women who proved what they could do, who faced discrimination and erasure, and whose achievements nevertheless changed America permanently and irreversibly. Everything we thought we knew about American women in World War II, that they were temporary workers filling in until men came home, that their service was a patriotic sidebar to the main story, that they happily returned to domestic life when the war ended. All of it was wrong. The real story is bigger, messier, more important, and more relevant to understanding modern America than the mythology ever suggested. These women built the weapons that won the war. They flew the planes, broke the codes, served in uniform, and held the home front together. They faced discrimination, harassment, unequal pay, and impossible burdens. They were pushed out of their jobs after the war and told to forget what they'd accomplished. They spent decades fighting for recognition of their service. But they changed everything anyway. They proved capabilities that could never be denied again. They inspired daughters and granddaughters to demand opportunities that previous generations had been denied. They laid the foundation for every advancement in gender equality that followed. They transformed American society in ways that are still unfolding today. That's the legacy. That's what really happened. And that's the story that deserves to be remembered.